Studio Trigger needs no introduction. Look at all these popular anime they made. This one's their best. Meanwhile, I'm over here in the corner having seen so little of their catalog, I'm borderline ashamed to call myself an anime fan. But even I know that a relatively chilled out and straightforward adaptation of a cooking manga doesn't fit the brazenly bombastic stereotype the studio is known for. This is Delicious in Dungeon, or Dungeon Meshi for all you Swedes out there. And let me tell ya, as someone who is, comparatively speaking, a difficult-to-please critic, especially when it comes to seasonals, I'm telling you right now, drop everything you're doing and watch this anime. So, Dungeon Meshi is a, currently 10 episodes in as I'm recording this, anime adaptation of Ryoko Kui's 2014 manga, which I also haven't read, directed by Yoshihiro Miyajima. More on him later. The story follows Laios, Marcille, and Chilchuk as they attempt to save Laios' sister Fallon from the belly of a dragon. One teensy problem. They're as rich as I am. This makes their food situation especially dire, because they can't buy enough to last them the entire dungeon until they meet the dragon again. So, Laios decides that they need to perform the ultimate taboo to survive: eat monsters. Thus, the stage is set. With the help of monster chef extraordinaire Senshi, our party is able to descend the dungeon while cooking up just about every species of monster they come across like they're grinding for an achievement. Right away, love the premise. More specifically, the depth with which it is executed. At its core, Dungeon Meshi is a new spin on an old concept. The monsters themselves are mostly classic fantasy monsters. Mermaids, dragons, mimics, living armor, undine, you know, the usual stuff. But a huge boon in keeping all these familiar monsters interesting is the unique food angle of the show, one that I haven't seen explored in quite the same way before. The show quickly settles into a bit of a formula, but while formula may have negative connotations, when it comes to this show, it's a pun if you think about it. You know, formula, kinda like recipe, am I right? I'm mentally unwell. Every half an episode or so, the gang cook up another meal, typically after defeating a monster. But the formula is essentially able to go on indefinitely for as long as Kui sees fit, because even if the basic rundown of events stays the same, the specifics get so varied and the show's writing is so strong that it never threatens to get dull. But considering the entire show so far is essentially built on keeping this formula interesting, getting to the heart of why it works so well is going to take a while. So, Part 1, the monsters. Dungeon Meshi is what I would describe as an encyclopedia show, in the sense that its world building is so obsessively intricate that you could literally write an encyclopedia covering it all. And sure enough, people have effectively done just that. There's even an officially released Adventurer's Bible by Kui herself that helps further flesh out the already fanatically rendered world. And it's not just fun factoids about the monsters either, but also their place within the larger ecosystem. In episode 7, Laios notes that there are less medium-sized monsters in the 4th floor of the dungeon than you'd expect to see. Though Senshi at first blames a shortage of bladefish on this, they're then attacked by a kraken. The party comes to the conclusion that the kraken's presence is actually to blame for the shortage of mid-sized monsters, as krakens feed on them. In the prior episode, it's revealed that treasure bugs, a previously introduced monster that resembles coins and other loot, feed on mimics. Treasure bugs enter a mimic's chest through the small crack between the top and bottom half, then lay their eggs. When the eggs hatch, the newborn insects feed on the mimic and take over its chest, waiting to be discovered by and then subsequently fool passing humans. This is the level of detail present in Dungeon Meshi's world building, and it's stuff like this that makes the dungeon feel enrapturing and alive. The literal location that is the dungeon isn't terribly interesting to me. but the monsters that inhabit it and the ecosystem they're a part of makes up the difference tenfold. Obviously, the food and how it tastes is a huge factor of the world building and the series messaging as well. The entire show is essentially home cooking and healthy eating propaganda. Emphasis is placed on just how vital having a good diet is to the party's adventure, with the primary reason for them losing to the dragon at the beginning of episode 1 being that they were all famished, causing their movements to be clumsy and unrefined. In episode 2, a couple of passing adventurers ask the party how to get stronger. Senshi responds in based fashion. First, improve your eating habits. Second, get enough sleep. Third, exercise. You absolute legend. But the aspect of the food I love the most is how the show dives head first into turning monsters that would seem inedible on the surface into the most appetizing delicacies known to man. Take, for example, the living armor in episode 3. Laios early on ponders whether or not he can eat living armor. Spoiler alert, it's metal, dumbass, of course you can. Or can you? As it turns out, although living armor is said to be nothing more than enchanted metal, in actuality it's a colony of mollusks that sandwich themselves in between layers of the armor and together form something similar to muscles that can move the armor as if it were possessed. And by God, can you eat them. It gets even better when Laios picks up a new sword from one of the armors because his old one broke, and it's also possessed by a creature, and he just decides to let it live and not tell anyone about it. And then he names it Kensuke, and then it turns out to be legitimately useful multiple times in their quest. Are you beginning to understand why the show's theme of cooking may be a metaphor for how hard Ryoko Kui was doing the same with this story? Senshi illegally plants crops on golems. Laios tries to eat food in a living painting. They drink Undyne in order to restore Marseille's magic. It's impossible to impress upon you the sheer creativity on display in the way this series tackles monsters and how you eat them, and all of it is possible thanks to how thoroughly the series is paced. I'ma keep it a buck with you. I initially expected this first arc in the dungeon to last like 5 episodes. We are currently on episode 10 and have only just met the dragon, which means there's probably still a couple episodes left to go before we leave. In part because I won't be satisfied with this arc unless the gang makes barbecue out of that dragon afterward, but also because this show is just methodically paced. And this is absolutely a good thing. For a show with such insane detail in its world building, spending an entire core in one dungeon not only makes sense, but just feels good. It feels good to get to know the entire ecosystem of this dungeon. It feels good to get such a wide variety of meals and monsters to learn and enjoy, all from this one locale. This show is immaculately paced in my opinion. Funnily enough, while doing research for this video, I ended up reading the Sakuga blog production notes for this show, and in it, Kaven says the show was actually too briskly paced for his liking. Kaven, I love you. You're the best active anime writer I know about. I deeply respect you. You have infinitely more knowledge about the industry than I currently do and probably ever will have, and you're an inspiration to me and many others. But my brother in Christ, I would have dropped this show like 5 times over by now if it had gone as slow as you wanted it to. So now we know how this show manages to keep the monsters the characters eat interesting. But what about the characters themselves? Well, the OP sports a bona fide cornucopia of characters, many of which have in fact appeared in the show. Our leads, number 4. Laios is essentially a raving monster otaku, and the de facto leader of the group. Senshi is similar to Laios in terms of his obsession with the monsters, but has gained that knowledge not through rabid fanaticism, but instead living in the dungeon and subsisting off of it for so long. Chilchuk and Marseille are the 2 party members who didn't quit after they got wiped out by the dragon in episode 1. Chilchuk is shrewd, sharp, and a bit prickly, but generally goes along with eating the monsters with little resistance. Marseille, on the other hand, starts off hating the idea of eating monster food and constantly complains about having to do it, but always ends up enjoying their meals by the end. These characters and their dynamic is infinitely watchable. Marcille and Senshi in particular are my two favorites. Marcille may constantly throw temper tantrums about needing to eat monsters, but at the end of the day, she's deeply loyal to her party, more easily swayed to the party's side by their bonds than any financial gain it may entail, and her reactions to food are always the most enjoyable to me. I am not joking when I say that 90% of my screenshots of this show are just her reacting to eating food. Her reactions being so entertaining are in part because she's just plain adorable, but also because she's always the one who's most reluctant to eat the food she's presented with, so it's the most satisfying to see her won over in the end by its taste. Senshi, on the other hand, is presented as sage, even if he has his quirks. He's bursting with knowledge about the dungeon and life within it, both understanding and helping maintain the ecosystem within it. As he eats the monsters in the dungeon, he strives to give back to it, and you can really sense his passion and love for monsters. I also just love his googly eyes. You'll never convince me this isn't peak character design. Many people also cite the series' comedy as one of its strong points, and while I reckon I don't find this show quite as funny as some, I will admit that its sense of humor is unique, to say the least. More specifically, for how chilled out this show is on a moment-to-moment basis, it's surprisingly willing to disrupt that atmosphere for out-of-nowhere gore and shockingly gruesome jokes. In episode 2, Marcille describes the textbook method for picking mandrakes as tying a dog to it via a rope, evacuating to a place where you can't hear the mandrake scream, and then having the dog run away, pulling the mandrake out but killing the dog. Marcille is so by the books in her knowledge of monsters that she doesn't realize how illogical this is, as the other characters immediately point out methods of picking mandrakes that don't involve killing innocent creatures. In episode 10, our gang has to skin frogs and wear their flesh to avoid getting stung by plants. I repeat, they skin frogs and wear their flesh! In order to convince Marcille to partake in their Lovecraftian horrors, everyone else has to tell her that they think she'll look totally cute in the frog suit. And then when she puts on the suit, her elf ears poke out, and Laios remarks that it makes her look even more like a real frog's head. This show is legendary. So, that's what keeps this show's basic formula chugging. Stellar character writing and interactions paired with glorious world building and a unique angle to portray it all from. But we're still missing a piece of the puzzle, because Trigger is the culprit behind this anime, or more specifically, director Yoshihiro Miyajima. In any given adaptation of a work of fiction, it's always best if the people involved, you know, like the thing they're adapting. In Miyajima's case, like doesn't even begin to describe it. When just a single volume of this manga was out, my boy Miyajima was already asking if Trigger could adapt it. He was a fan of Kui's before she even created Dungeon Meshi, and once her cooking manga became popular, an anime was inevitable, and Miyajima was so down to be a part of it. Though his initial pitch was rejected, in 2019, Trigger was approached to create a commercial video commemorating the 8th volume of the manga. Miyajima got wind of this, and you can probably guess how he reacted. He got accepted as director for the promotional video, and so it was made. It's a stellar advertisement, by the way. If I had seen this back when it came out, I probably would have become a manga reader right then and there. Mind you, when this PV was made, there were no plans for Trigger to adapt a full Dungeon Meshi anime. But as fate would have it, when it was time to adapt the real deal, Miyajima was respected enough to land Dungeon Meshi as his very first directorial project. This anime is, in part, the result of 10 years of passion on Miyajima's part, which not only makes for a cool story, but also helps shine a light on the methodology of how it was adapted. There was emphasis on directing as much of the manga as possible, hence the 24 episodes its first season is slated for. There was emphasis on consulting directly with Kui to make sure that the adaptation was to her liking, which I'm sure it is having seen the final product. It may also help explain why, for the most part, it's actually a fairly typical adaptation. Polished, yes. Stellar, absolutely. And it does make some minor deviations from the source material. but it doesn't go full trigger wacko crazy mode the way some people might have expected. But I don't mean to insinuate that this anime doesn't have Trigger's creative DNA all over it, or more accurately, Miyajima's creative DNA. He's only worked at Trigger for his entire time in the anime industry since the studio's beginnings, his initial role being that of production manager. He was a massive Gainax fan going into the job, so it only makes sense that his directorial debut still feels sincerely Trigger, even if it's relatively reined in. Plus, full Trigger bombast doesn't fit this show. It just doesn't. This show's visual presentation gets a chef's kiss and a half from me. Everything from the god-tier character designs to the extremely consistent animation that occasionally goes all out during action scenes, to the fact that the show never compromises on its portrayal of the monsters, even when it's a giant kraken that I can only assume would be exceptionally difficult to animate. It's all put together about a billion times better than your bog-standard seasonal. Something that seems to have been given the A+ treatment in this show is the characters' expressions. Right about any shot that contains all 4 leads will have them each giving a different expression that matches their personality to a T. There are too many cuts of great character art and animation to count, but to show some highlights, in episode 5 there's these cuts of Senshi whimsically dashing around and offing ghosts with homemade holy water that never fails to make me smile. In episode 6, Punished Chilchuck reaches his lowest point when his locksmith tools are used as eating utensils. This Marcille face from episode 2. Marcille getting caught by the plant in episode 1. Marcille having a tantrum atop the Kraken in episode 7. Marcille burning her tongue in episode 4. I just really like Marcille, you guys. This clip from episode 3 contains more joy than you will feel in your entire life. Undying jump scare. I feel like I've almost hammered in the point too much, yet I've only scratched the surface of my screenshots folder. Even in the show's most standard animation cuts, the characters retain a certain bounciness to them, like they're perpetually one step away from going deliberately off-model for a punchline or snappy cut of animation. In a lesser show, characters can feel overly stiff and rote, and like you'll rarely, if ever, see a surprising cut of animation from them. But Dungeon Meshi is the exact opposite of this, with everything feeling subtly free-form, even in its least visually impressive moments. Speaking of episode 3, the boards in that episode were particularly strong, IMO. Ichigo Kano was the storyboarder for that episode, and so many shots from it are stuck in my head now. In particular, this episode seems to bend over backwards to craft as many shots as possible where characters are framed within the loop of Marcille's staff. Not to mention this amazing shot, aka best low-res anime bait possible. Or what about this shot that puts the camera in the perspective of a knight's head hurtling towards Marcille? I also love the color design, done by Hitoki Takeda and Nanako Okazaki. It's a very earthy palette, yet tastefully so, making for a show that's pleasantly vibrant while also capturing that fantasy dungeon aesthetic. Dungeon Meshi might very well be anime of the season for winter 2024, and hell, maybe even next season considering it'll still be airing then. I don't know. I'll get back to you on that once I watch Sengoku Yoko. What I can tell you though is that it'd be a mistake to keep up with seasonal anime and somehow miss out on this. Granted, it's a mistake to keep up with seasonal anime period, but listen, you can reduce your sin levels by watching the actually good shows. From what I've been told, Dungeon Meshi only gets better the further into it you get, and considering I already have it at an 8 out of 10, I'm more excited to finish this than any other show I've covered while it was airing. The OP implies a vast, sprawling adventure from here on out, and I am so down for it. If you enjoyed this video, watch some of my others, and if you want to support my ability to keep making these videos, donate to my Patreon so you can get shouted out at the end of each video, just like Bidoofus, CJ, Funky Boy Haas, Jose Ramirez, Karen Chan, KD Pack, Minnie, Neon Manta, Dr. Awu, and God of Vile Eyes. Thank you for your patronage.